So, are you ready to see a sample student paper that doesn't need dynamite to fix it? Stay tuned. In the past, I've had a lot of Comp 1 students ask me, after seeing the first sample student essay, The Punks of Yesterday and Today, is this for real? Is someone really that bad? Well, I've actually seen a lot worse essays than that. But I don't want to give you the wrong opinion and think that I've only seen bad essays. I get a lot of really great stuff. Great stuff requires work, though. And it requires a different level of work. You've got to go a little bit above and beyond the call of duty. And even your first draft is going to need a little bit of extra work. What exactly does all that entail? I'm glad you asked. Okay, one thing you should know about this essay before we really get into it is that it was written way back in, I think, 2005 or 6 when the original Will and Grace series was on. And although that was like 15 or 16 years ago, the world is a whole lot different place now than it is then. For a long time, I was thinking that I would have to quit using this essay because I wondered if anyone knew what it was talking about. And I was getting ready to find a replacement, but then NBC threw me a wrench because they brought it back for another year or so. I like this essay for a few reasons. One is that after doing animal rights and after doing The Punks of Yesterday and Today, this is a whole lot better than those are. And it's good that we have a range of quality of papers as well. Now, I'm not saying this is perfection by any means, shape, or form. There are many things to do with it. But it definitely does need polish. This is one of the few of the sample essays where I can kind of remember the person who wrote it. Good student. What we're looking at is his rough draft, and I'm pretty sure that everything I cover in this were things I covered with him when he came to talk to me about it, and he fixed them all, and this turned into be an A paper in the end. So the thing to get out of here is that revision isn't just when you're way far away. It can turn a okay paper into something that's really, really good. But let's look at the rough draft version of it. The introduction is a little bit all over the place, but that's kind of how rough draft papers tend to work. I've always thought you do your rough draft and then you probably know what you should be writing better than any other times. Then you need to go back and revise that introduction again. This needed a bit more work. It needs to be a bit more specific because they tend to be covering a lot of different things. You look at lessons. Will and Grace can be seen, I don't like the word can there, it could also be seen as a giant popsicle. But it can be seen as a portrayal of the way heterosexuals view the homosexual subculture. Taken quite literally, the subject of analysis in this thesis statement is the show Will and Grace. But you take the sentence before it, and you start to bring in the viewers and what their perceptions are. Then you bring the two sentences before that, and we start to talk about the people creating the show. So there's a whole lot of things in there that can really end up confusing us. We do know that it's about the show Will and Grace, and we know it has something to do about the differences between straight and gay. So we've at least learned something. And we know that there is a conflict between these two. Not bad for an introduction. Will and Grace was an immensely successful show. In what way? They end up talking all about awards, but I'm not really sure that that's the only method for achieving success. And this is something that you should probably keep in mind. There might be multiple ways in which a word can be interpreted, and it never hurts to spell them out. So this talks about it. 7 seasons, now entering its 8th. So yeah, that would be 2005 or 6 when this paper was done. The show had maintained high ratings. Okay, lots of people watched it. The show had been nominated for 73 Emmys. Lots of Emmy nominations, lots of award nominations, and then we get to the Golden Globe, SAG Awards, People's Choice Awards, and the GLAAD Awards. So you go through these. The Emmys are kind of the gold standard for TV. You got the Screen Actors Guild, which aren't as popularly known. They have a very weird statue of a genital-free man holding up masks. Whatever. The People's Choice Awards, which tend to get mocked by a lot of people, but awards are awards, I guess. You have the Golden Globes, which might be the ugliest trophy I've ever seen in my life, and you have the GLAAD Awards. Now, the first time I remember reading through this, I kept thinking, one of these things is not like the other. The GLAAD Awards tells something completely different than the other awards do. Is this something the paper is going to get into? Is it something that's in the scope of the paper? All of these are a little strange, though, because by telling us about all these awards, you're telling us that lots of people liked the show, but you're putting the focus on the audience and not on the show itself. This is a theme. We're going to come back to this. The success of the show has seen as surprising, especially when considering its timing. A television series with a gay or lesbian as a main character was not expected to occur to much further in the future. The only one that came out was when Ellen came out before and her show went away. The difference that sets Will and Grace apart from Ellen is that it resisted becoming a political show or a gay show. Hold on to that thought. Because first, before we get into that, we got to really point out just how much stuff has happened between now and then. Ellen's show came out I think she came out in 91? I'll have to look that up at some point. But you think about it, that's not in any historical context very long. You look at the chart. And from 1996 to 2011, we're talking 15 years, people who disapproved of gay marriage went from around 68% to around 45%. That's a sizable drop. And people who thought that gay marriage should be recognized, in 96 it was a little under 30%, and it ended up in 2011, 15 years later, being a little over 50%. So significant change in 15 years is really a kind of short period of time. You know, when I was saying earlier I wasn't sure about keeping this paper, this is one of the reasons why. The world that we're living in is so much different than the world in which this paper is written in. But students consistently tell me that they still like and still want this paper. But it is something you're going to have to keep in mind as we go through this, that our society is a lot different than the society of when this paper came out, although it was long ago. Ellen coming out was a big deal at the time because no one ever had done that, and everyone thought it was going to be pretty much career suicide. She's ended up being okay. She's got another show where she can abuse her underlings and such. But lots of other stuff has changed. Just simply being gay isn't really a shock for anyone nowadays. Anyone comes out as, oh, by the way, I'm gay or bisexual or something, the world kind of just goes, okay, yeah, whatever, and moves on. It was not this way when the show was on the air. Yet, Ellen's show was deemed political, and Will and Grace's show was deemed not political. What does a political show mean in this case? I mean, Ellen certainly wasn't talking about running for office, so there's a different definition of politics going on here. And as far as what does a gay show mean, I'm also kind of at a loss to define that. And what made this one that much more entertaining for me is when I was putting together this video, I did the image search, and utterly nothing came up for a gay show, unless I turned the safe search off. And then I'm sure that I would get bad teaching evaluations if I did that. So they're using these terms, political show, gay show. Would it be a good idea to know what they're talking about? This is one of the things that the revision process is probably going to need. You need to end up defining the terms, because having these terms defined could really change how we perceive the argument. Onward. We keep talking about this bit. Will and Grace is a product from outside the homosexual population. NBC is by no means pro-gay rights. The cast was NBC went and said that this wasn't because of us. Will and Grace has been continually reaffirmed as to not being a political show, even if it deals with many issues that can be deemed as political. Can be deemed at passive verbs, ugh. But still, even if it deals with issues that could be called political. So what is the difference? This is kind of confusing. And this is something that definitely needs to be cleared up in the paper. Now, I think you can definitely clear it up, but just saying that it's not political, although it deals with political things, makes me wonder what they're talking about. Define the terms, it gets to be a lot easier. But we have another issue at work here. Is the cast of the show the same thing as the show itself? Is the audience of the show the same thing as the show itself? These are all separate things. I mean, you know the famous painting, "This is not a pipe." Well, it was a painting of a pipe. Well, actually, what we're looking at is a printing of a book that has a drawing of the painting of a pipe. You gotta be careful with your subjects here. Can you do everything about the show, everything about the audience, everything about the creator, and still have it all work for a 6-page paper? It's going to be problematic. Homosexuals may claim that is indeed a product straight out of gay culture. May be the case, but also makes the audience rather than the show subject. And then you have, although being gay, Max can be described as someone who is in no way homosexual. This sentence is key evidence as to why defining gay and homosexual is important, nay, vital. Yes, I wrote nay, vital. Because we're talking about different things. How you think of yourself, your gender identity, is different than your orientation, who you find attractive and want to go to town on, which is different than your biological sex, what your chromosomes and dangly bits are like, which is different than how you look. And one of the reasons why this paper stood out so much for me is, as I said, this was done in like 2005, and that's a quite different world than what we're living in now. So it was a very good insight. It was just one that needed to be defined a lot more. When we talk about the diverse groups of homosexuals, Will is seen as passive verbs. I mentioned that I'd be coming back to them. Passive verbs are annoying because who sees Will as an extremely progressive character is really kind of important here. Whereas homosexuals have historically only been portrayed as flamboyant and feminine, Will is an extremely masculine character. So who sees him as progressive? Subjectivity is important. You gotta spell this out. So-and-so sees Will as a progressive character. It's a part of the argument. But this isn't a long paragraph, and then you get to, but at the same time, you can view it in a completely different way. And this is one of these phrases that, for me, signals that we're moving on to a new topic. And what happens when you have a new topic? You should be moving on to a new paragraph, right? Doing things like that will keep the organization more detailed, which means it will be easier for the reader to get into the paper. Onward. Will not being gay enough can be because in the previous paragraphs they said they started the show without him in a relationship, so you don't have to think about him as gay. It denatures his sexuality. The audience doesn't have to think about him as gay. Which, again, and particularly for 15 years ago, is a pretty good insight. If you have someone who's gay but doesn't act the way they think is gay, is he gay to the audience? When they did want to put him in relationships, these relationships did not seem to have much of a homosexual association. You see, it's another problem with them not defining gay and homosexual, is that they don't really use them consistently either. Anyway, when Will is in a relationship, he ends up taking a more feminine role. Because there's some kind of problem with being ultra-masculine and gay. Can you have them both? Well, this paper is kind of on the fence about that. Or at least the show is. all these aspects of Will's character show us a lot of how members outside the gay community see the subculture. And this is, again, a place where the subjectivity starts to get away from the paper, because how the audience sees them is a bit different than how it's portrayed. And you can't just describe portrayals and say this is why the audience sees them in this way. Your proof about what's happening in the show isn't necessarily how people are going to interpret it. But because I don't want to sound like I'm being totally negative here, there is a real difference then in what people think of when they think of gay. Are we the gay on the left or the gay on the right? Well, the stereotypes will probably lead more towards the gay on the left, but this was also on a pride parade, so go figure. Identity is a confusing thing. When you're dealing with confusing topics, you really have to be able to define your terms, and it's that much more on you when you're dealing with a complex topic to make sure everything is as clear and laid out as possible. Okay, so we have the other side of the gay spectrum. We have the character before who is progressive in some ways, but then they just can't commit to it, and he ends up being non-progressive. Then we have Jack, who is a true queen. However, at the same time, he's cute, lovable, and hilarious, so nobody is really threatened by him. And this is the one paragraph that really talks about Jack, and it's pretty interesting that you spend all this time on Will, and then the one who is the walking stereotype gets one paragraph. But you got to pick and choose your battles in a paper. I think this paper might have even been better if they would have focused on a couple episodes or a season as opposed to trying to do a cross-cut of the show, because it would have allowed the writer to keep all the examples from a similar place. And that would make the argument seem that much more attached to a specific bit of thing. You can always extrapolate. The show is constantly reaffirming the superiority of heterosexual relationships and demeaning homosexual relationships. And this is right after they talk about Jack being the butt of the jokes because he's weak, and even Will thinks that. So there's this weird connection between strength and sexuality that, again, probably could be spelled out a little bit better. Although this paper is mainly focused on the negatives associated with Will and Grace, it is important to know the progressive steps it has made. However, everyone involved in the production of it continually claimed that the show is not a gay show. Okay, well, again, we've got that subject thing going back and forth. It may deal with gay subject matter and all, but it comes down to one thing. Will and Grace is a sitcom. And then the rest of the paragraph, well, it's just a sitcom, so why are we taking this all that seriously? And I remember that the student, when he came in to talk to me about the paper, I told him that it seemed almost like he was doing the, okay, don't hurt me, I have to be fair to everybody, please don't get upset. And I told him that it was really kind of undermining his entire argument. You can't go on and say that there are these negatives. Oh, and by the way, it's just a TV show, so really, why should we care? And he admitted that that was what he was doing. He was trying to go, I don't want people to be mad at me. Again, it was a lot different to be writing this paper in 2005 than it is to be reading it in 2020. And that's something we have to think about too. So, what do I like about this paper? It's dealing with what's seen as a light and frivolous show for the most part, but it hits some pretty serious issues about identity in a way that wasn't part of the common conversation at the time. Does it do it consistently? No. Does it stay focused enough? Again, not really. But those things are easily fixable. You fix those things and you have what are pretty advanced insights from a college freshman at the time. You can see why I end up liking this paper a lot. Particularly when it ends up fixing the things that need to be fixed. It's well worth it. I said it a few times in our discussion, but I really can't stress this enough. The world is a drastically different place than it was 15 years ago when this student wrote this paper. And while 2020 is a little bit of a dumpster fire, we've come a long way in terms of how we see each other and how we think about identity, particularly for the LGBTQ folks out there. Now, the reason I have been hammering this one is because one of the things that made this a really good paper was the guy who wrote it took some chances. He was thinking about stuff in depth that a lot of people weren't talking about. He took some chances in his approach, and he made sure that he could justify his arguments. He really put forth an effort. And while it's a better draft than any of the other sample student papers we've seen so far, it is still a first draft, and everything that we covered in this video is stuff that I remember this guy going back and fixing. And I wish I had a copy of the final paper, or could remember who wrote it, because it was dynamite. It was really good and focused. But I've seen a lot of good papers. Put forth the effort. Teach me something. Don't give me the same old thing. And I know you can do one too. See you in the next video.